Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I'm Peter Murray, Curator-in-Chief at NLA, London's Centre for the Built Environment. As a result of COVID-19, cities are under threat. We read of property prices in the suburbs and in the countryside rocketing as people move out to find more space and clean air. During lockdowns, city centres are emptied and shops, restaurants, bars, museums and theatres face economic ruin. The whole idea of agglomeration, a key driver of urban economy, is threatened by social distancing. So our cities are in real need of champions. And who more, an effective champion, could they wish for than my guest, Lord Norman Foster, founder and executive chairman of Foster and Partners and president of the Norman Foster Foundation. In October, he gave the opening keynote address to the UN Forum of Mayors in Geneva. He told metropolitan leaders from around the world that in the face of the pandemic, cities will prove their resilience and appeal. They will bounce back stronger and better as a consequence. Norman, welcome to the conference and to the discussions around the post-crisis city. And perhaps I can start by asking you about the history of cities and the idea that in the past, we've seen positive outcomes as a result of disasters. Often buildings, services and health were improved, but I'm reminded that the poor quality of life in the 19th century city also led to the drive to suburbanization, the Garden City movement, new towns, and in England to the Abercrombie Plan for London. That was done in 1944, but the outflow from the centre, the shrinking of London, led to 40 years of economic and population decline in the UK capital. So do you think we need to have equally powerful planning strategies today to defend the city in the post-pandemic years?
Don't you think that really the history of cities is cyclic, and you can always point to those periods in history when the city was still attractive, as New York in the 70s, the aftermath of the Plan for London that you've mentioned. But really, surely it's relative. The city, even at its most periods of despair, has always been attractive. And this idea that the exodus of the city, I mean, in the 1832 cholera epidemic, which killed off 1 in 7 of New York's population. Half the population moved out to the country. But historically, and this is a repetitive pattern, the city always bounces back stronger, more resilient, and with a higher quality of public infrastructure, whether those are open spaces in the way that Central Park and its reservoirs was a response to that particular epidemic. We've seen the same pattern in London in the 19th century. We've seen the same thing much more recently, albeit on a smaller scale, the Great Smog rather, of 1952 resulted in the Clean Air Act 4 years later and the switch from coal to gas and making the city cleaner. So I at the moment see no signs for that pattern, that cycle reversing itself.
So what sort of time scale are you looking at? As I say, Abercrombie had a 40-year impact on London. How long do you think the cities will take to get back to something?
Well, again, I think it's the rate of change. I mean, after the Spanish flu epidemic, in a very, very short period of time, you saw an explosion of buildings which didn't exist before and which brought people together in larger public gatherings, whether that was the cinema, whether it was sports stadia. So it will seem to me as if in the immediate aftermath that everything has changed. I think with the perspective of history, it will be seen that the pandemic has accelerated trends which were already evident. So particularly mobility, I think the transformations that we're on the cusp of in terms of mobility will liberate huge areas of city centers for trees, for landscaping, for to make the city healthier, safer, quieter, and more human.
But do city leaders need to have strong policies to, might say, protect the sort of city we see at the moment, where dense centres are really important as a part of the economic agglomeration that they require, or do we leave it, might say, almost to the market to decide that people want to move out of cities, or, as you say, we may see changes in the way we move around cities, but do we need something maybe like an Abercrombie to define how the city should be in the future?
I think you need something which is not necessarily fashionable at the moment, and that's called planning. And all the great civic qualities in cities were the result of deliberate acts of planning by dedicated individuals at a civic leadership level. And those cities that have that will benefit from it. Those, I suspect, that have a more laissez-faire, leave it to the market, will not take advantage of the opportunities. And the thing that perhaps is new is attitude of mind. So we've seen pedestrianization, the proliferation of public space organically happen. And there is an appetite for that. So I think the great opportunity is an appetite for change. And interestingly, those cities which come to prominence have strong civic leaders who really do care about the future of their citizens and the city.
So, I mean, one of those strong city leaders is Anne Hidalgo in Paris, of course, and it was in Paris that the discussion started around Carlos Moreno's ideas of the 15-minute city, the idea that people can work, shop, dine, be educated, entertain, and be entertained within walking distance of their home. And you know, the idea of commuting becomes a thing of the past. But will that lead to a sort of suburbanized city, do you think, the 15-minute city?
Well, first of all, the 15-minute city is not exactly new. I mean, 90% of Londoners live within a 15-minute walk of a high street. I grew up in a suburb of Manchester, but I was within 15 minutes of everything you described. It wasn't called a high street, it was called Stockport Road. So this is not exactly new. Of course, what is welcome is the resurge in its popularity and its appeal. But I think that you're mistaken to confuse the suburbs with the high street. So the high street may be in proximity to the city core, the civic core of a city, but it's not exactly the suburbs where you're dependent on all the things that you described, where you have to get into a car. And interestingly, statistically now, whether it's the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, whether it's the fiscal group in the UK, demonstrating that that high density, that proximity, doesn't equate with high infection levels. Quite the reverse. The infection levels were higher in the lower density boroughs of London than in the more densely occupied areas. Perhaps the issue comes right back to something that we've known about for a long time, and that is the quality of housing. So dense households where too many people are packed in too small a space, that's always been unhealthy, and the pandemic has magnified that.
But I mean, I would agree with you absolutely about the idea of there have been 15-minute cities around for a long time, and London is a perfect example, I think, of a polycentric city where you have, as you say, high streets and people can get to a lot of the facilities fairly easy. But we also need high quality density, and we need a vital centre. We need, don't we, in at least in major cities, art galleries, theatres, restaurants, workers and tourists to deliver a sort of momentum and agglomeration if one's to retain status, particularly in London as a global city, and particularly not only as we come out of COVID-19, but also as we come out of Brexit.
Absolutely, but what you're describing quite rightly is that we need choice. And one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And of course, the civic centre, but once you take into account some of the cumulative effects of the trends that we're seeing, where there is an increasing appetite for on-demand mobility services, whether that's Uber, whether it's Lyft, you have younger generations who are less interested in ownership. You have the potential of cars which can platoon by artificial intelligence. They can stack densely and safely. Electrification, cleaner, quieter. You put these trends together and the likelihood is that the traffic will be moving, but there will be fewer and fewer parked cars. The prospect of a city where typically 2/3 of the open space between buildings is given to cars, to parking, cars which are parked for 80% of their life. I think if you put these tendencies together, you could see a massive shift where that 2/3 devoted to car-borne mobility is shrunken to the 1/3, and you have a dramatic increase in the availability of public open space. If you ally this to some of the trends which might offer more choice in terms of urban farming, then perhaps an obsolete car park of the past becomes the perfect urban farm that can deliver food fresher, more cheaply, without the transport costs from the countryside. So I think the challenge is really intelligently grasping these opportunities and planning to take advantage of them to improve the quality of urban life. And the future, of course, as we all know, is the city.
But even in a period when, as you say, you have mobility as a service, you have people nipping around on scooters, on bicycles, and in electric cars, micro mobility, all those things, there will there not be a conflict between movement and place. I mean, something we're seeing at the moment, as you say, it will get better with autonomy, but how do we actually change existing cities to deal with that?
I think that, cities, the history of the city is the constancy of change, and cities, I think, are extraordinarily resilient, will respond to change, and I think it's a question of balance. I think a city that had no mechanical mobility, without that kind of kinetic dimension, would be a very dull place indeed. I think it's a matter of degree. I think there's a point where the mobility is a servant to the quality of life, and a point where it proliferates to the extent that it threatens that quality of life through pollution, through congestion, and I think we have the prospect of a far better balance.
So you've suggested that traditional workplaces will survive, but be used more flexibly. I mean, you've described how you see people home working in an alpine area or a digital Starbucks in the high street. If that happens, we'll probably see substantial redundancy, I would imagine, of existing office buildings in city centres, which sort of raises two questions for me. One, can modern office buildings, particularly tall ones, be satisfactorily converted into other uses, such as residential? And if we have fewer people working in central areas, could the knock-on impact on amenities and services lead to a sort of hollowing out of city centres, sort of thing we saw in 1970s, particularly in cities in the US?
The buildings which offer flexibility for change, and some are more adaptable in that sense, are likely to survive, to be recycled, or by their very nature are better adapted to a post-COVID world. I mean, if you take a recent project like Bloomberg in the City of London, it has multiple routes in terms of access, internal movement. It has a high degree of natural ventilation, so the air change rate is 2.5 times that of a typical sealed refrigerating box. So a building like that, although it wasn't consciously conceived for a pandemic era or post-pandemic, is infinitely more attractive by virtue of those healthy qualities. So a building like that, which is the outcome of a progressive industry leader concerned about the welfare of a workforce, is currently a kind of progressive fringe. That's likely to become much more mainstream. But again, we have seen buildings over time. I mean, the Georgian Terrace, which was a residential concept, has proved itself adaptable to a far wider range of uses. I think that my own personal belief is that the workplace, the traditional workplace, will not be occupied all the time by the same number of people. It will be a different occupancy cycle. And working at home, again, which is not exactly new, but has been given a kind of renaissance by the pandemic, and the development of those technologies, which enable so much more to be done remotely. But the core activity of people coming together, I don't believe the future of humanity is 2-meter distancing.
But a lot of people would say that much more home working is a key part of what's going to be happening post-COVID. And I believe you carried out a survey in the office, and you found just sort of 80% average efficiency and effectiveness for people working at home. Was that because of people need to get together to be able to do the sorts of things that architects do? Was it because maybe they didn't have the right kit at home, or why do you think that was?
I think that the technology has enabled us to be far more resourceful, but I think it's also developed an even greater hunger for proximity, for coming together, for humans congregating. In our case, it's the creative drive where spontaneity, the gathering, the impromptu, those are difficult to recreate, although some of my younger colleagues would point to the pioneering work that we've done in terms of virtual reality, and perhaps challenge that. But also the social dimension of the workplace. Remember, you know, back in the 1970s, in the Willis Faber project, we'd incorporated a swimming pool, the roof garden. I mean, those things are as valid today as they were attractive then. Of course, at that time, Ipswich, which was the location of this building, didn't have those facilities. But even since, when those facilities have become available, the social dimension of what was described at the time as a paper factory. In other words, not a kind of creative entity like so many workplaces are, not just those for designers, but whether you're conceiving software, hardware, whatever, it's essentially a creative activity. So I think that will endure, and the more alienation away from the gathering place, I think it's the luxury of options. And of course, the other aspect of the pandemic is that it's made us appreciative of those who don't have the luxury of working at home, and who need a physical presence to be able to keep the city and all its facilities running. And that's a constant.
Yes, I was actually cycling through Ipswich the other day, and I came across the Willis building there. And I have to say, Norman, it really still looks very spectacular, and sits very nicely into the city, and they've looked after it very well. But it made me think that actually you, of course, were early on into the idea of well-being in offices. With that had a green roof, didn't it? A park where people could get up on the top of the building. You had swimming pools, social facilities, all sorts of things in that building at the time. And
flexi time also.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah. And I think that about that time, of course, or just before, you had done the Olsen building, which again was something which was designed around total restructuring of the sort of management and social systems within the office, which is something which is really still, even more important today.
Yes, I mean, all of these trends have been constant over time. I mean, they go back for me to the 1960s, when sustainability was a mantra, although we weren't calling it sustainability. It was, if you like, the architectural manifestation of the writers, the philosophers of that time, whether that was Buckminster Fuller, whether it was Rachel Carson, who had identified the harmful effects of DDT as a fertilizer on the ecosystem. So that's been the constant, and perhaps its latest manifestation is in some of the projects that I was starting to describe, like Bloomberg, but it could be Apple with its garden, but that's a response to a suburban Californian Silicon Valley environment. But it's nonetheless, it's the same emphasis on the social dimension of working. I mean, if you're tasked with the challenge of designing a building that's going to achieve medical breakthroughs, and you're at a table with a group of Nobel Science Prize winners as scientists, they're going to take for granted that their laboratories are going to work. What they're really concerned about are the social spaces where people come together and where different specialities interact with each other, where you can break down barriers. So there's the social dimension of the creative workplace, whether it's about medical research, whether it's about creativity as in design, or in strategic political business planning. It's human interactive, and I believe that's a constant.
So you said that your hope is that the post-pandemic city will be about we, and not me. Is that being a bit optimistic, do you think, in a future which without doubt is going to see a lot of hardship and anger as a result of the pandemic, while at the same time we're in what seems to be a more divided political world at the moment?
Well, yes, I did say, and your quote is quite accurate, but the expanded version of that quote is a plea for greater autonomy, a greater balance, questioning the big centralized, globalized system, and suggesting a plea for more autonomy in the development of energy as in power, in growing, in manufacturing, and the we, the global collective, being about addressing the big issues of climate change, of health, So it was, in a way, an architectural manifestation in a beneficial, in a positive way, the opposite of the populism, which is about nationalism and which is very, very close to racism. So, and I instanced the forest fires, which left 2.5 million Californians without power because of an ailing infrastructure, a bankrupt energy supplier, and the way in which everybody was rushing out to buy home generators, and a plea to decentralize the distribution of power. That can be power politically, it can be power as in energy which keeps you, hot or cold, civilized. And there is a relationship between the access to power, to life expectancy, to political sexual liberation. So there's a moral imperative there, but it was a plea for a greater balance.
So one final question is about how we're going to live. I mean, you obviously have, might say, a global lifestyle. We all travel a lot. We think we should travel a lot less in the future. How do you see the way that a global firm like Foster and Partners is going to operate in a post-COVID environment?
Well, I think that against all expectations, we've been able to do far more than we ever expected that we would be able to in these circumstances. I think we've also made available a range of applications which we've been working on for over 50 years and which are now, in circumstances which we couldn't have envisaged at the time, are serving us very well. But at the risk of repetition, it's not a substitute for the time when those of us come together. I mean, I think that we've all, in our different ways, in a whole spectrum of professions, have adapted with great resilience to the challenges. But that only goes so far.
So have you put in your order for an electric aeroplane yet?
Can't wait for it to arrive. I'll be the first customer.
Excellent. I look forward to that. So, Norman, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much. Thank you for your insights. Cities will be the engines in recovery as we come out of this crisis, and it's vital that as a society we have faith in their benefits while at the same time working harder to reduce their failings. So thank you very much indeed. It's been very enjoyable talking to you and to hear your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.